Welcome, dear listeners, to another captivating episode of Echoes of Genius. I'm your host, Dr. Amelia Resonance, and today we're in for an extraordinary treat. For our new listeners, Echoes of Genius is where we bring together great minds from history to explore their creative processes and lasting impact. Today, we're about to embark on a journey through the emotional landscapes of two titans of classical music. Get ready to explore the wellsprings of creativity with none other than Wolfgang, Amadeus, Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. But before we dive in, let me give you a taste of what's to come. Imagine Mozart describing his compositional process as a babbling brook in springtime, while Beethoven likens his to a battle against silence. Intrigued? Well, stay tuned as we unravel these fascinating contrasts and much more. Gentlemen, welcome to Echoes of Genius. It's an absolute honor to have you both here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, dear Dr. Resonance. What a delightful little show you have here.
Indeed, it is an honor to participate in such a discourse.
Let's dive right in, shall we? We're here to explore the nature of musical creativity, and I can think of no better place to start than with you, Mozart. You've often likened your compositional process to a naturally flowing stream. Can you elaborate on this for our listeners?
Ah, yes. You see, for me, music is as natural as breathing. It flows from my mind like a babbling brook in springtime. I simply listen and write what I hear in my head. It's effortless, really. Why? I've composed entire pieces while playing billiards or travelling in a carriage.
That's fascinating. How do you balance this natural flow with the structural demands of musical composition?
Oh, it's all part of the same delightful game. The rules of composition are like the banks of the stream. They guide the flow, but they don't constrain it. The melodies, harmonies, and rhythms all dance together in perfect balance, just as nature intended.
Can you give us an example of how this approach manifests in one of your works?
Certainly. Take my Symphony No. 41, the Jupiter Symphony, for instance. The final movement combines sonata form with fugue in a way that's complex yet sounds completely natural and joyous. It's as if the different musical elements are engaged in a lively conversation, each one flowing into the next with perfect ease.
Beethoven, your perspective seems quite different. You've described music as a battleground. Can you tell us more about that?
Indeed, Dr. Resonance. For me, composing is a constant struggle, a battle against silence and mediocrity. Each note must be won through effort and determination. Take my Ode to Joy, for instance. I sketched over 200 versions of that theme before I was satisfied. Music is not a gentle stream, but a tempest that must be tamed and shaped into something profound.
That's a powerful image. You speak of filling silence with meaning. Can you delve deeper into this concept?
Gladly. You see, as my hearing failed, silence became my constant companion. But in that silence, I found a canvas for the music of my soul. Each composition became a defiant shout against the encroaching quiet, a way to fill the void with beauty and emotion that others could hear, even if I could not.
Can you give us an example of a piece that embodies this struggle?
My late string quartets, particularly Op. 131, are perhaps the purest expression of this struggle, music that pushes against the very boundaries of sound and silence. In these works, I sought to express the inexpressible, to capture the profound emotions that words cannot convey.
These contrasting approaches are fascinating. Mozart, you speak of perfection as a natural outcome, while Beethoven, you describe it as a hard-won victory. How do you think these different perspectives shaped your music and, indeed, the evolution of classical music as a whole?
Well, my dear, I believe that my approach allowed for a certain lightness and charm in my music. It's accessible, yet complex, like a perfectly balanced meal that delights without overwhelming the palate. My opera, The Marriage of Figaro, for example, combines intricate musical structures with melodies that seem to spring forth effortlessly, reflecting the natural flow of human emotions and interactions.
And I would argue that my struggles pushed the boundaries of what music could express. Each composition was a new summit to be conquered, expanding the emotional range and power of music. My third symphony, the Eroica, broke new ground in its scale and emotional depth, paving the way for the Romantic era.
It's remarkable how these different approaches have both left such indelible marks on musical history. Mozart, how did your method influence your productivity?
Oh, it allowed me to compose at a rather prolific rate. In my busiest years, I could complete 2 or 3 piano concertos in a matter of weeks. The ideas simply flowed, one after another. It was as if the music was always there, waiting to be transcribed.
And Beethoven, how did your more laborious process affect the types of works you created?
My method led me to create fewer works, but each one was meticulously crafted and often larger in scale. My symphonies, for instance, grew progressively longer and more complex as I sought to fully express my musical ideas. The Ninth Symphony, with its choral finale, is perhaps the ultimate expression of this approach, a work that pushes the boundaries of the symphonic form to its limits.
Fascinating. Now, let's explore how your personal experiences and emotions influenced your compositions. Mozart, your music is often described as joyful and full of life. How did your personality and experiences shape your compositions?
Oh, life is too short not to be merry, don't you think? My music reflects the joy I find in every day. Take The Marriage of Figaro, for instance. It's full of wit and humour, much like the delightful social encounters I so enjoyed. But don't be fooled, there's depth there too. Even in my most cheerful pieces, you'll find moments of profound emotion.
Indeed, your work does span quite an emotional range. How do you move from the comic operas to works like your Requiem?
Ah, the Requiem. You know, even in the face of death, there is beauty to be found. The Requiem was a chance to explore the deeper, more sombre aspects of life, but even there, you'll find moments of light and hope. Life is a tapestry of emotions, and music should reflect that.
Can you give us an example of how you achieved this balance in the Requiem?
Certainly. The Lacrimosa movement, for instance, is sorrowful yet achingly beautiful, capturing the complexity of human grief. It begins with a weeping melody, but as it progresses, there's a sense of acceptance and even a glimmer of hope. It's as if the music itself is coming to terms with mortality.
Beethoven, your music is often described as emotionally intense and deeply personal. How did your life experiences, particularly your hearing loss, influence your compositions?
My struggles, Dr. Resonance, became the very essence of my music. As my world grew quieter, my inner musical voice grew louder. The Heiligenstadt Testament marks a turning point. It was there that I resolved to live for my art, to express through music what I could no longer hear in the world around me.
Can you walk us through how this transformation is reflected in your work?
Certainly. My early work showed the influence of Mozart and Haydn, structured classical. But as my hearing faded, my music became more revolutionary. The Eroica Symphony marks this shift. It's a musical declaration of artistic independence. By my late period, works like the late string quartets pushed beyond conventional forms, expressing emotions that words cannot capture.
Can you give us a specific example of how your personal struggles manifested in your music?
The Grosse Fuge, originally part of my string quartet No. 13, is perhaps the most radical example, a piece that still challenges listeners today. It's a musical representation of my inner turmoil, my struggle against fate, and my determination to create despite my affliction. The complexity and intensity of the piece reflect the depth of emotion I was grappling with at the time.
It's fascinating how your personal journeys are so clearly reflected in your music. Mozart, how did your travels and encounters with other composers influence your style?
Oh, travel broadens the mind splendidly. My journeys across Europe exposed me to a wealth of musical styles. In Italy, I fell in love with opera. In London, I was inspired by Johann Christian Bach. Each experience added new colours to my musical palette.
Can you give us an example of how these influences manifested in your work?
Certainly. My string quartet No. 6, dedicated to Haydn, shows the influence of my friendship with that great composer. It's more complex and daring than my earlier quartets. You can hear echoes of Haydn's wit and inventiveness, but interpreted through my own sensibilities. It's a delightful musical conversation between our styles.
And Beethoven, your music often seems to reflect broader societal themes. How did your views on politics and humanity influence your work?
Music, Dr. Resonance, has the power to change the world. My Eroica Symphony was initially dedicated to Napoleon, whom I saw as a liberator. When he declared himself emperor, I angrily scratched out the dedication. The symphony became about the idea of the hero, the struggle for freedom and dignity. This belief in music's power to express and inspire noble ideals runs through all my work.
Can you give us an example of how these ideals are expressed in your music?
My Ninth Symphony, particularly the Ode to Joy finale, is perhaps the clearest expression of these ideals. The text speaks of universal brotherhood, and the music itself, with its journey from darkness to light, its combination of symphonic and choral forces, embodies the struggle and ultimate triumph of the human spirit. It's a musical manifestation of my belief in the potential for human unity and transcendence.
It's clear that both of you saw music as far more than mere entertainment. How did you deal with criticism or public reception of your work?
Oh, critics. They can be such a nuisance, can't they? I remember when my opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio, was first performed. Emperor Joseph II said there were too many notes. I simply replied, "There are just as many notes as there should be, Your Majesty." You see, I trusted in my art, even when others didn't quite understand it at first.
I, too, faced my share of criticism. My innovations were not always immediately appreciated. The premiere of my Ninth Symphony, for instance, was met with mixed reactions, but I was convinced of the value of my work. I once told a prince who was complaining about my music, "What I shit is better than anything you could ever think up." Perhaps not my most diplomatic moment, but I stood by my artistic vision.
Your confidence in your art is truly inspiring. Let's delve deeper into your compositional techniques. Mozart, you're known for your ability to compose entire works in your head. Can you tell us more about this process?
It's quite simple, really. The music appears in my mind fully formed, like a beautiful apple on a tree. I simply pluck it and write it down. Why? After hearing Allegri's Miserere just once in the Sistine Chapel, I was able to transcribe it entirely from memory.
That's extraordinary. How does this ability translate to different musical forms? Symphonies, concertos, operas?
Each form is like a different game with its own rules and challenges. A symphony is a grand conversation between instruments, while an opera is a world unto itself, full of characters and drama. But whether it's a simple sonata or a complex opera, the music flows just the same.
Can you give us an example of how this mental composition process worked for a specific piece?
Certainly. For my piano concerto No. 21, the famous second movement came to me as a complete melodic idea. I could hear the interplay between the piano and the orchestra, the way the melody would be passed between different instruments. It was then simply a matter of orchestrating what I heard in my mind.
Fascinating. And what role does improvisation play in your process?
Oh, improvisation is the spice of musical life. In performance, I love to improvise cadenzas. It keeps the music fresh and alive. And often, these improvisations become the seeds of new compositions.
Can you give us an example of a piece that grew out of improvisation?
My fantasy in D minor for piano is a good example. It has the spontaneous feel of an improvisation, though it's a fully written-out piece. The sudden shifts in mood and the free-flowing structure reflect the improvisatory nature of its origin. It's as if I'm inviting the listener into my creative process, letting them experience the joy of spontaneous musical invention.
Beethoven, your approach seems quite different. You're known for pushing the boundaries of classical forms. Can you tell us about your compositional process?
Unlike Mozart, my process is one of constant revision and refinement. I fill sketchbooks with ideas, working and reworking them until they meet my exacting standards. Take the Grosse Fuge. It was originally the finale of my string quartet No. 13. I later replaced it with a new finale, and the fugue became a standalone piece. Each work is a journey of discovery.
You transformed the symphony into a vehicle for profound expression. How did you approach this form?
The symphony, to me, became a microcosm of the human experience. From the fateful opening of my Fifth Symphony to the choral finale of my Ninth, each symphony is a world unto itself, expressing the full range of human emotion and aspiration.
Can you give us a specific example of how you expanded the symphonic form?
In my Third Symphony, the Eroica, I expanded the traditional symphonic form, nearly doubling its length and vastly increasing its emotional scope. The first movement alone is longer than many entire symphonies of the previous era. I introduced a funeral march as the second movement, something unprecedented in a symphony at the time. The whole work is a journey from heroic struggle to triumphs, pushing the expressive capabilities of the orchestra to new limits.
You once said, music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. Can you elaborate on this?
Gladly. You see, music speaks directly to the soul in a way that words cannot. It can express the inexpressible, touch the intangible. In my late works, particularly the late string quartets, I sought to push music to its limits, to create sounds that could convey the deepest truths of human existence.
Can you give us an example of a piece that embodies this philosophy?
The Cavatina from my string quartet No. 13 is a perfect example. It expresses a profound sorrow and longing that no words could adequately capture. In the middle section, marked beklemmt or oppressed, the first violin seems to struggle to express itself, mirroring the human struggle to articulate deep emotions. It's a moment of raw, unfiltered feeling translated into sound.
Thank you both for these profound insights into your creative processes. Now, let's engage in a bit of musical time travel in our Time Warp segment. Before we we begin our time warp, let's briefly discuss the actual musical developments that occurred between your eras. Mozart, you worked primarily in the classical period, while Beethoven, your work bridged the classical and romantic eras. What are your thoughts on this transition?
Oh, it was a time of great change. The classical style, with its emphasis on balance and clarity, was giving way to more emotional expression. I like to think I pushed the boundaries a bit myself, especially in my later works.
Indeed, I saw myself as expanding on the classical tradition, infusing it with greater emotional depth and formal innovation. The Romantic composers who followed took this even further, emphasizing individual expression and programmatic music.
Excellent context. Now, Mozart, imagine you're composing in Beethoven's era. How would your music change?
Oh, what a delightful thought experiment. With those marvelous pianos of the 19th century, I'd certainly explore new sonorities. And the expanded orchestra, oh, the colours I could paint with. Perhaps I'd write a grand symphony with a chorus inspired by Beethoven's Ninth, but with my own lighter touch. But I think I'd still be myself. Perhaps my music would be grander in scale, but it would still have that lightness, that joy. I'd probably scandalise the Romantics with my refusal to brood.
And Beethoven, how do you think your music would have developed if you were composing in Mozart's time?
An intriguing question. Without the influence of the French Revolution, perhaps my music would have been less revolutionary. And if I hadn't experienced hearing loss, who knows? But I believe the fire within me would have found expression somehow. Perhaps I would have pushed the boundaries of the classical style from within rather than breaking them entirely.
Can you elaborate on how you might have approached opera in Mozart's time?
I might have written more operas inspired by Mozart's mastery of the form, but infused with my own dramatic sensibilities. Perhaps I would have explored deeper psychological themes within the constraints of the classical opera structure. I can imagine crafting areas that push the boundaries of vocal expression, much as my late piano sonatas pushed the limits of the instrument.
It's fascinating to consider these alternate musical histories. How do you think you might have influenced each other if you had been contemporaries?
Oh, I would have loved to collaborate with Ludwig here. Can you imagine? His fire and my flow, we could have created something truly extraordinary. Perhaps an opera that combines my melodic gift with his dramatic intensity.
Indeed, Wolfgang's melodic gift combined with my drive for innovation, it would have been a formidable partnership. I can envision a set of variations for piano duo where we each bring our unique strengths to the fore.
Oh, what fun that would be. I can just imagine us trading themes back and forth, each putting our own spin on the other's ideas. It would be like a musical conversation, full of wit and passion.
Yes, and perhaps we could have pushed each other to even greater heights of creativity. Your lightness might have tempered my intensity, while my boldness might have inspired you to even greater harmonic adventures.
The mind boggles at the possibilities. Now, let's consider your legacies and how they continue to resonate today. Mozart, your music seems to have a universal appeal that transcends time and culture. What are your thoughts on this enduring popularity?
It's quite flattering, I must say. I think perhaps it's because my music speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the joy of being alive. I hear my melodies are used in the most fascinating ways now, in moving pictures and even in studies of the mind. The Mozart effect, they call it. How delightful.
Indeed, the Mozart effect suggests that listening to your music can temporarily enhance cognitive performance. Your works are also frequently used in music education. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'd like to think it's because my music combines accessibility with complexity. It's easy to enjoy on first hearing, yet reveals new layers of intricacy with each listen. My piano sonata No, 16 in C major, for instance, is often used to teach budding pianists. It's simple enough for beginners to play, yet contains all the elements of classical sonata form.
Beethoven, your music and your image have had a profound impact on culture, well beyond the realm of classical music. How do you view your legacy?
It is humbling to think that my music continues to speak to people across the centuries. I strove to create music that expressed the highest aspirations of humanity, and it seems that these ideas still resonate. I'm told that my Ninth Symphony has become a symbol of hope and unity, that it was played when the Berlin Wall fell. This, to me, is the true power of music.
Indeed, your works have inspired countless musicians across various genres. Can you speak to how your personal story, particularly your struggle with hearing loss, has contributed to your enduring fame?
I suppose my story serves as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. The fact that I composed some of my greatest works while deaf demonstrates that limitations need not define us. My Third Symphony, The Eroica was written as I was coming to terms with my hearing loss. It represents a triumph of will over adversity, a message that seems to resonate across time.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious, are there any modern composers or genres that you find particularly intriguing?
Oh, how I would love to hear the music of today. I'm fascinated by what I've learned about jazz. The way it combines structure with spontaneous improvisation sounds delightful. And these electronic instruments, I can only imagine the sounds one could create with them.
I find myself drawn to the idea of minimalism. The thought of creating profound emotional impact with limited musical material is intriguing. In the symphonic works of Shostakovich, I hear he pushed the form even further than I did.
Fascinating insights. Now, let's engage in a bit of creative problem solving with our creative challenge segment. Here's our challenge. How would you address, through music, the modern issue of technology's impact on human connection? To add a twist, you must incorporate at least one modern sound or instrument in your piece. Mozart, let's start with you.
Oh, what a fascinating problem. I propose a comic opera. Imagine a stage full of people, all absorbed in their little glowing devices, singing arias about their virtual lives, but completely ignoring each other. Then, perhaps a power failure brings them back to reality, and they rediscover the joy of direct human interaction. It would be a delightful commentary on your modern world.
And how would you incorporate modern sounds?
For the modern sound, I'd incorporate the beeps and buzzes of these devices into the orchestration, perhaps using synthesizers to mimic these sounds. I can imagine a duet between a soprano and a ringtone, or an aria accompanied by the gentle tapping of fingers on screens. Oh, the comedic possibilities are endless.
That sounds both entertaining and thought-provoking. Beethoven, what's your take on this challenge?
I envision a powerful symphony in 4 movements. The first would represent the chaos of the digital world, fragmented melodies, electronic sounds. The second would express the loneliness and isolation that can come from too much technology. The third movement would be a struggle, a battle to reconnect. And the final movement would be a triumphant celebration of human connection, perhaps with a choral finale extolling the virtues of real-world interaction.
And how would you incorporate modern elements?
I would incorporate electronic instruments throughout, using them to represent the digital world, but gradually blending them with traditional orchestral instruments as human connections are reformed. Perhaps I would use a synthesizer to create a persistent mechanical ostinato in the early movements, which would be gradually overtaken by the warmth of the string section as the piece progresses.
Both fascinating approaches. Now, here's a real challenge. Can you collaborate to sketch out a piece that blends both of your styles to address this theme?
Oh, how exciting. What do you say, Ludwig? Shall we create a little musical miracle together?
I'm intrigued by the possibility. Perhaps we could start with your lighthearted approach, Wolfgang, gradually building to a more dramatic confrontation with the issue.
Yes. We could begin with a cheerful theme representing face-to-face interaction, then introduce a contrasting mechanical theme for technology. I'm thinking a playful melody on traditional instruments interrupted by electronic beeps and bloops.
And then we could develop these themes, showing how they conflict and eventually find harmony. We could use a full orchestra, but also incorporate electronic instruments and sounds. The struggle between the two could be represented by complex counterpoint and dramatic dynamic shifts.
Brilliantly said, my dear Ludwig. We could end with a fugue interweaving both themes to show how technology and human connection can coexist. Perhaps the electronic sounds could form a rhythmic base, while the orchestra and voices build a joyful celebration of human interaction on top.
Yes, and we could conclude with a grand, uplifting finale that combines all elements, acoustic, electronic, and vocal, in a harmonious whole, symbolizing the balance between technology and human connection.
Oh, what I wouldn't give to hear this piece performed.
What an incredible collaboration. I think I speak for all our listeners when I say we'd love to hear that piece. As we come to the end of our time together, I'd like to thank you both for this illuminating conversation. Before we wrap up, what do you hope modern listeners will take away from your music?
I hope they find joy pure and simple. Even in my most complex works, there's a delight in the act of creation that I hope comes through. And perhaps they'll be inspired to approach their own creative endeavors with the same spirit of playful exploration.
For me, I hope listeners find the courage to persevere through adversity, to push boundaries, and to express their deepest emotions. Music has the power to touch the soul and elevate the human spirit. I hope my works continue to do that for generations to come.
We've explored the contrasting yet complementary nature of your approaches to music and creativity. Mozart, your natural, joyful flow, and Beethoven. Your passionate struggle to push the boundaries of expression. Both have left an indelible mark on the world of music and continue to inspire creators today. What strikes me most is how your emotional journeys are so clearly reflected in your music. Mozart, your works mirror the joy and vivacity with which you approached life, while Beethoven, your compositions are a testament to your ability to transform personal struggles into universal expressions of the human spirit. To our listeners, I encourage you to explore the emotional depths of classical music with fresh ears. Whether it's the effortless charm of a Mozart piano concerto or the earth-shaking power of a Beethoven symphony, remember that behind every note is a human story, an emotional landscape waiting to be discovered. Here's a listening challenge for you. Try pairing Mozart's Symphony No. 41, Jupiter, with Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, Eroica. Listen for the contrasts in style and emotion, but also for the common threads of genius that run through both works. How does each piece make you feel? How do they reflect what we've discussed today about their creators' approaches to music? Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the hearts and minds of two musical geniuses. Next week on Echoes of Genius, we'll be exploring the intersection of art and science with Leonardo da Vinci and Marie Curie. How did the Renaissance man's artistic eye influence his scientific discoveries? And how did Madame Curie's groundbreaking research shape her view of the world? Tune in to find out. If today's discussion has sparked your creativity, we'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts on how Mozart and Beethoven's insights might apply to modern creativity using the hashtag #EchoesOfGenius. And don't forget to check out our Echoes of Genius playlist, featuring key works we discussed in today's episode. Until next time, I'm Dr. Amelia Resonance, reminding you that the echoes of genius resound through time, inspiring us all to reach for the sublime. Thank you for listening.